Thank you, and thank you for a truly stimulating discussion. I really feel a bit of an interloper here because I'm probably the last surviving technologically illiterate Indian. But it's been, and this is really thanks to Tuan that I'm here, and I think all of us still are familiar with that tingle on the skin that you get when you see in real life someone whose face you've only seen on front pages of newspapers or the television screen. So it's immensely honored, sir, to meet you, Governor Dukakis. I listened some years ago to your Kimball lecture at the UN Association here in Boston, and you were speaking about the strengthening of the role of international institutions, and you made the very compelling point, which I think is relevant today, that by strengthening institutions, you do not make them autonomous or outside your control, but you, in a sense, give them the power to strengthen yourselves and strengthen your capacity for collective action. I also should pay a tribute to Miss Ripley, your third grade teacher, who urged you to run for president of class council and so led to the distinguished career in public service in the cause of the state, the nation, and the world. Thank you very much, sir. And talking about the state of Massachusetts, one also realizes that this state, whose constitution precedes that of the United States, in 1780 itself had talked about education as a means for cherishing education in the sciences. And the fact that that was articulated in a formal constitutional document, which lay the rules and paradigm, if you will, for the governance of the state, shows how apposite it is that we are discussing this issue here today. Max spoke very eloquently about the larger picture of history and where we are in this panoply of time, if you will. I sometimes feel it's useful to look at a particular day in the context of history and see what it has meant over the years. And if we take today, the 25th of April, in terms purely of human discovery, human achievement, human research. It was on this day in 1953 that Crick and Watson defined DNA through the structure of the double helix. It was on this day in 1954 that the first practical solar cell came into being. It was on this day in 1960 that the submarine Triton completed its circumnavigation of the oceans. It was on this day in 1961 that the patent for the first integrated circuit was awarded. It was on this day in 1983 that a spaceship transcended the limits of Pluto. And yet it was also on this day in 1981, 30 years before Fukushima, that 100 workers at Tsuruga, a nuclear power factory in Japan, suffered the consequences of radiation. And finally, moving it away from the field of sciences, but into the field of human discovery and achievement. It was on this day, the 25th of April, 1945, that the San Francisco Conference began, which was to define, create, and set the rules for the United Nations, and open up the possibilities that we see here today. And when Tuan this morning spoke about the relative smallness of the size of this room, it behooves us to remember that in 1945, we had but 50 delegates who worked in a space of 10 weeks to create the organization that we take for granted today. And what was the very first resolution that the new United Nations adopted, debated? It was a resolution put forward to the United Nations by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and France, and a 6th country, who I'm so glad to see represented here this morning, Canada. These 6 countries put forward what is now known as Resolution 1/1, the very first resolution of the United Nations. It is a resolution titled, "The establishment of a commission to deal with the problems associated with the discovery of atomic energy." And if you look at the text of the resolution and you transpose, if you will, some of the terms relating to atomic energy and nuclear energy to the subject we're discussing today, artificial intelligence, you will see just how possible it is for the United Nations to be the agent of the change that we seek, or if not change, at least the instrument to be able to encourage the benevolence and the benign aspects of what we've discussed, and yet the instrument to be able to limit those which are more lethal, more invasive, more dangerous. The Commission, according to Resolution 1.1/1, was created for extending between all nations the exchange of basic scientific information for peaceful ends. No argument there. B, for control of atomic energy to the extent necessary to ensure its use only for peaceful purposes. Substitute AI for AE. C, for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and of all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. And this brings us to laws of the lethal autonomous weapon systems, which Dr. Savage spoke about. There we are, a perfect home for that category. And then for effective safeguards by way of inspection and other means to protect compliant states against the hazards of violations and evasions. Something we've just come through this morning and which Dr. Sibleswijk very eloquently described in the 7 layers of the proposal that has been put forward by the Boston Global Forum. So here we are at the moment in a sense of quandary, because at one stage, the United Nations, the 193 governments that constitute it, and more important, the 7 billion people who constitute those governments, are working to try and achieve within a space of the next 12 years what have come to be defined or called the Sustainable Development Goals. And the fact is that each one of these goals, whether dealing with poverty or hunger or sanitation or disease or the rights of women or peaceful structures, inclusive societies, consumption, production, each one of this has the capacity to be enriched and furthered by the right use of artificial intelligence. And yet, at the same time, we see that there are 2 dangers. One, which has been discussed in detail today, the possibility of a misuse of artificial intelligence, and therefore the need, if not a regulatory mechanism, at least an open, introspective mechanism, which blends together the wisdom and the power of science with the prudence and the power of governance. That's the one. And the second, and this in a sense might well be the 8th layer of our approach, is the danger that artificial intelligence will leave people behind, and so accentuate the disparities and the gaps within nations, between nations, within populations, between populations. Because if artificial intelligence is to become economical and democratic, you may not have that danger. But if it is to become an instrument in the hands of either malign political power or benign economic power for the sake of particular populations or particular communities, then we will really risk, in Max's phrase, being on this rudderless ship to obsolescence, because that obsolescence will be when countries feel that they can no longer afford or involve themselves in the process of those discoveries, and then return to means that are primeval and primitive. The other possibility I think that we should keep in mind is trying to segregate, if you will, the weaponry aspect or the defensive danger, defense and dangers of artificial intelligence with the strictly social and the economic. Because one of the problems I think that we made in the case of atomic energy, and reference was made to the more current debate on the internet, is trying to amalgamate all of these into a single paradigm. That means, in effect, that you are persuading countries or governments to retreat from an agreement on policies that they would otherwise concur because they are afraid of bringing in elements on which they have a difference. So maybe there is a case for us to reflect, and I can think of no audience or group better than this, to think of the possibility of having 2 or 3 regimes, if you will, governance structures, if you will, voluntary means of creating an international consensus on artificial intelligence. Because ultimately, when you come down to it, you may have all the artificial intelligence you will to get the data you need to be able to communicate what is real on the ground in terms of deprivation, in terms of disease, in terms of despair to policymakers. But it will be a long while, if at all, before you actually get artificial intelligence to create for you the policies that will alleviate them. Very simply put, I would suggest to you that artificial intelligence is real. It is no longer a possibility. Artificial reason is something which I do not think we will ever attain. Reason will remain within the domain of human intelligence, of human capacity, and it is our responsibility to exercise that reason, either as scholars, as practitioners, or as political leaders and governments, to be able to take this a step further. In just 18 months from now, the United Nations will be observing its 75th anniversary, 75 years from that day in San Francisco and the coming into being of the organization that I mentioned. And I think back to a wonderful line from one of the oldest educational institutions in the world, which comes from Premier Allward's province, New Brunswick, the University of New Brunswick, which in its charter said it was created so that the sons whose time of life and former hopes showed the need for formal education. What a beautiful phrase, a time of life, the United Nations at 75. And what a chilling phrase, former hopes. Because if the hopes that we had in 1945, and the hopes which have by no means died down in 2018, if those hopes are to be thwarted because of a lack of education, then we will all be the poorer for it. And this is where, with all respect, I think the Boston Global Forum comes in. Because you have the opportunity not only to talk among the knowledgeable and extend the reach of your knowledge, but you have the ability to be able to use your knowledge to be able to inspire, persuade, and change the attitudes of governments. I would even, as you know, we at the United Nations are incredibly fond of acronyms. I would even suggest very respectfully that BGF, for the Boston Global Forum, could stand for Bring Governments Forward. Bring them forward. Show them your reason. Show them your logic. Show them both the potential that they can exercise in political leadership and show them the dangers to which they must remain alive if they are not to succumb to what we very narrowly saw in the case of atomic energy, what we continue to skirt around but might well see in outer space, what we have successfully, as was mentioned, done in the case of biological and chemical weapons. All these are possibilities. And the world of 2018 has shown that there is nothing which is beyond the willingness of nations to cooperate upon and to realize. But for that, they need a measure of intellectual direction and leadership, which only you can provide. And I look forward to your doing that. Thank you very much.